So we're back. Here's section 2.3, absolute value and number lines. So you can imagine one of the reasons we're looking at absolute value is when we start to do operations, we want them to understand that you look at the absolute value of the number to make decisions about maybe adding or subtracting. And we use this a lot in all of our operations. Okay, so notice there's a context here, and here we really start to develop more the idea of looking at our referential point. So the submarine dove 15 meters below the surface of the water. Here we say, what integer best represents the submarine's location relative to the surface of the water? Okay, so this is how we're defining our number line here, so we could see that this would be 15, negative 15. Okay, we could have just as easily said, what is the submarine's, how far below the surface of the water is it, and then it would be a positive 15. Okay. What word indicates the sign of this number? So that would be below. 0 represents the surface of the water. Okay. And then we're going to start to get them to see the connection between absolute value and integers, and that opposites have the same absolute value. So really when I think of this section, it's giving words and terminology to something they already see that you want to draw their attention to. So they make inherent connections between 15 and negative 15 because, hey, look, this says 15 meters. The below is making us say negative, but they see this magnitude, this absolute value of 15 more than they see negative 15. So we want them to start to connect that there's two different numbers, 15 and negative 15. Okay, they're different numbers, but one way that they're connected is that their absolute values are identical. And so scrolling down a little bit. Okay, also you'll see in the homework assignment, we'll also focus a little bit on having them write the correct notation for absolute value. So some things that they do is sometimes they'll put the negative on the outside of the absolute value sign, but then they'll still say it's positive, or they don't know whether it goes on the inside or outside and they say it's negative. Okay, and we also talk, this is actually in part F, so we do this here too. Talking about absolute value as the absolute value bars as similar to parentheses in the order of operations. You do what's in the absolute value first. Okay. Scroll down a little bit. Now, opposites and number lines. Okay, so we're thinking of an opposite, specifically on the number line, we're thinking of it as a reflection across the reflection line of 0 here. So here's for the opposite of 4. You think of this as an opposite sign, and the opposite of 4 is negative 4. So this is connecting the idea of an action. An opposite is a reflection, and the reflection gives you the sign with the opposite number, opposite sign. Okay, so opposite of negative 4 is 4, because if we start at negative 4, we're reflecting to positive 4. Okay, and this is put here after absolute value because they can see opposites have the same absolute value. Okay, and notice sometimes we can think of the opposite, and we think of this when we think about fields and the real number axioms. So if we had 4, oops, that's not the best pen. Here we're thinking of the opposite of 4 is negative 4. Okay, but we could also think of negative 4 as negative 1 times 4. And this is how it's defined in the real number system. But we also want them to think of opposites as changing the sign. And also this also involves multiplication. So we can connect these two ideas. The opposite is equivalent to multiplying by negative 1. But when we think of opposites, we really want to think of changing the sign. In terms of chips, which we'll see later, we'll want to think of opposites as flipping a chip. Okay, and you'll see more what I mean about that later. And then with number lines, the reflection. Okay, so notice some of these questions. They're going to focus on 0 and again reflecting. And then also based on the pattern above, what do you think the opposite of -5 is? So this will help them learn to see that here we're starting in the innermost parentheses, we're at -5. We take the opposite again, and it takes us back to where we started. So sometimes we say 2 negatives equals a positive, but we want them to see this action of taking an opposite and then repeating it kind of undoes taking the opposite, so that 2 cancel each other out. And we want them to see this in the terms of the reflection line here, and later you can show them in the context of the chips. Okay. And let's start a new video for the next section.